Assalamu alaikum. Peace to all our viewers. Welcome to the Brotherhood of Peace. Today we have a special guest, Imam, coming from the West End Masjid in Atlanta. Imam Nadim Ali. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Let me start off by saying that it was a beautiful khutbah that you gave at Jumu'ah Friday, the service that we have on Fridays. I was, the little time that we have, I don't want to hold you up. I wanted to know if you could, for our viewers, give us a summary.
Like a recap. Inshallah. Over the past few months, I've been just focusing on the power of Surah Al-Ma'un, where Allah talks about the person who denies the day of judgment, the person who repels the orphan harshly, the person who denies the feeding of the hungry. And he also says, woe to the superficial worshiper who are neglectful of their prayers and only pray to be seen of men. And so when I look at that, it just reminds me of this day and time, in that specifically with all of the right-wing activities going on throughout the world, and seeing Muslims. There was a scholar that said he went to the Muslim lands and he saw Islam, Muslims with no Islam. And he went to the non-Muslim lands, I believe he visited France. He said he saw Islam, but he didn't see any Muslims. And what he was meaning by that is that the ethics, the laws, a lot of the structure that's in place in Western society is Islam. Allah says he gives us a mizan, a balance. And so as Muslims, we have to basically start looking at Islam as a total way of life and not just as a religion. So what I was trying to say in the Khutbah Friday is that we not only supposed to serve Muslims, we're supposed to serve non-Muslims. And as you know, living in Chicago, I live in Atlanta, from the Philadelphia area, there's a lot of homelessness in the society. There's a lot of drug addiction in society, a lot of violence in the society, a lot of domestic violence. There's just so many problems in the society that Islam can be the medicine for the society. And as Muslims, we have to be the physicians. We have the best medicine. We have the penicillin for the spiritual infection that's involved in the society. And so, but first of all, we have to know how to administer it. And that takes, again, the 5 daily prayers. That takes for us to internalize the Islam, not necessarily just to give dawah or to call people to Islam. It's not about converting, it's about conversing. It's about, because the Prophet ﷺ lived in a society that wasn't monolithic. Again, he had non-Muslims around, he had animists around him, he had Christians around him, he had Jews around him, and he had Muslims, just like in our society today. So the best example is the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and I recited the hadith where he says that, who is your neighbor? Like that surah opened up with neighborly needs. Who is your neighbor? He said, your neighbor is anybody 40 houses in any direction. So if each Muslim counted the 40 houses in any direction, we would be neighbors to everybody in this country, everybody in the world. You're talking about what, 1 billion people? The 1.5 billion people in the world are Muslims. If every Muslim took that attitude, we'd be neighbors to everybody. And so we have to basically be of those who extol the neighborly needs, not of those who deny the neighborly needs, because it talks about those people who deny basic neighborly needs. And the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, said that if you want to know a person, ask his neighbor. Ask his neighbor. And how do we get to know people, as the Prophet ﷺ said? We work with them. We do business with them, we travel with them, we live with them. That's how you get to know somebody. So there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of hikmah in these hadith. And then once we internalize them, and the Prophet ﷺ was a master of brevity. He didn't give long discourses, he just would drop a little bit on you, and that little bit will be pregnant with meaning. And so that's why we have to sort of allow the meaning of the Quran, the meaning of the hadith to be birthed within our very soul and spirits.
I know you were up here for an event dealing with Islamophobia. Can you speak on that for us?
Yeah, and as a person from African American descent, we see Islamophobia as just a new manifestation of racism. And so many of our immigrant brothers and sisters are just realizing or just seeing the dangers of racism. And so this event was called by the founder of Sound Vision, Brother Abdul Malik Mujahid. And he basically was pulled in people from around the country. We were working on a group called the Burma Task Force. I'm a part of that as well. If you know what's going on in Burma, at one time there were 3 million Muslims in Burma. And Myanmar is the name, I guess the present name of the country now. And they have basically engaged in genocide there, so now there's only 2 million Muslims there. And they have Muslims in concentration camps. They're raping Muslim women, they killing Muslims, they're taking their citizenship away from them. And so they're doing that in Burma. There are laws being passed all around the world against Muslims. Even in one European country, they said now Muslims and Jews can't engage in religious slaughtering. You can't zabiha, nor can the Jews have kosher meat in one Muslim country. So there's this worldwide attack. In fact, there's been about $180 million just invested or in giving a false narrative of Islam. And so that's a lot of money, $180 million, probably even more than that. And so what we're trying to do is trying to counteract a lot of the negative impressions of Muslim and Islam through coming together and putting together a program so that we can address it before it gets too thick and too bad here. Because it's the same country that exterminated the Native Americans, imported the African Americans, basically put the Japanese Americans in concentration camps, and also lynched many African Americans who were trying to just get to vote or have their basic rights. So Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz made a comment 2 weeks before he died. He said that this country has the ability to build gas ovens just as the society that Hitler lived in built gas ovens for the Jews. He said that this country has that same ability. And there's a quote that Imam Jamil used to give us all the time. He said that fascism, which is extreme patriotism, will come to America, but it will be called patriotism. Fascism is what Mussolini practiced and a form of the Nazis practiced. So it's like an extreme form of racism and patriotism that you are basically superior, which is white supremacy for the most part. Right. And so we're basically trying to put together, be proactive as opposed to reactive, because we react too much. We need to be proactive and play chess and think in several moves ahead. So that's what the whole workshop was about. It was a retreat, and several people from around the country was there, and it was productive.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. What do you think? This Islamophobia. What kind of impact does it have on the situation with Imam Jamil al-Amin?
Well, I think his conviction was a direct result of Islamophobia. When they interviewed me about his case back when it happened, back in 2001, one of the points I made, I said, specifically after 9/11 happened, I said no Muslim will be able to get a free trial in an American court at this point. Because you have to understand, before 9/11, Muslims had like a favorable rating of like 50-something%. And after 9/11, it went down to like 27%. And so what we have to understand is that the Islamophobia or just prejudice against Muslims, a person goes in with a kufi, a person goes in with a Muslim name, and even if they're not practicing, there's a certain type of, there's a concept called mimetics. And mimetics basically means that all you have to do is say a word, and if the person who's practicing mimetics is doing their job, that word will conjure up an image in the minds of a person. So if you say Muslim, then because all of the CNN and all the other ends, they basically say, well, Muslims is associated with terrorism. So today, a person hear the word Muslim, they're associated with terrorism. They see people praying, they're associated with suicide bombers. And so mimetics is a science that people who engage in propaganda utilize, so that any word, if we say Allah, it conjures up a certain thing. So as Muslims, we have to again also practice mimetics, but have a positive spin on it, so that it's normalized that we are part of the society, specifically in the African American community. Probably every African American family in this country has a Muslim relative or neighbor.
Real quick for our viewers, if you can give them, tell them about Imam Jamil al-Amin, because not too many people know about Imam, especially people my age.
Oh, no. Yeah, Imam Jamil, alhamdulillah, he was formerly known as H. Rap Brown. And if you look at the whole concept of rap, it was really named after him. Mm-hmm. You know, when we listen to rap music, you know, they try to call it hip hop, which was from the what's that, the Rapper's Delight, mm-hmm. Hip hop, hippity hop. And so they called it hip hop, so that came later. But rap was things that we were doing in the streets. You know, a guy standing on the corner, he rapping. If you trying to talk to a lady, you rapping. You know, and so we were rapping, you know, while other people were napping, as the last poets would say. And so Imam Jamil, what he would do is during the Civil Rights Movement, when he was a part of SNCC, which is the student, it was initially called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was really the student wing of the Civil Rights Movement. They did the sit-ins, all that. John Lewis, he was a member of SNCC. Stokely Carmichael, who became known as Kwame Toure, he was also one of the leaders of SNCC. And then the third leader of SNCC was a man named H. Rap Brown, who later became Jamil Al-Amin. And so they basically, specifically under the influence of El-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, because if you look at the movie Selma, you'll see where Malcolm X visited Selma. And he was invited there by a lady who she passed away a few years ago, Faye Bellamy. And she was also a significant member of SNCC. And so he basically was able to influence the students to basically look at a human rights struggle as opposed to a civil rights struggle. And so Imam Jamil was embarked on that path. Again, they changed the name from Nonviolent Coordinating Committee because nonviolence reduces your options on how you struggle. Again, a quote from El-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, he says, don't struggle only within the ground rules that those that you're struggling against define. You know, so they tell you how to struggle against them. If nonviolence is the only way, you know, they give you that pass. But when you looked around the world during that time, when you had Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, with the Mau Mau, you saw the people in South struggling against South Africa. So all around the world, people were struggling against oppression, you know, not through nonviolence, but through other ways. And also, Malcolm, he has so many quotes. He says that sit-ins are effective when you're in the majority. In India, he said sitting in because they were in the majority against the British. And so they said that when they did sit-ins, it was like an elephant sitting down. When African Americans over here did sit-ins, it was like a mouse sitting down because we weren't the majority. And so passive resistance can work if you're in the majority. When you basically have greater challenges, then active resistance becomes a tool. And so that's one of the methodologies that Imam Jamil was embarking on. When you look at after the death of El-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz, you saw the groups like the Black Panther Party being formed, the Black Liberation Army being formed. And so Imam Jamil was he was one of the most serious revolutionaries out there during his time period. And then he was arrested back in 71. And then during that period, he did 5 years in jail. He became a Muslim. And then after that, he came out and he used his organizing skills from the civil rights movement to create Majlis Asuras all around the country, organizing the Muslims into national think tanks because Muslims were just scattered all over the place. And so he came into Islam through a group called the Darul Islam Movement. And then when the Darul Islam Movement folded, we created the movement Al-Ummah, or we called it the National Community under his leadership. And so his role was to basically give a voice to the indigenous Muslims, you know. And so the indigenous Muslims, primarily African American Muslims, didn't necessarily have a voice because, again, most of the leadership of the Islamic community at that time were primarily immigrants who didn't necessarily have a connection to the struggle. Many of us came into Islam out of the civil rights movement, Pan-Africanist movement, and so we looked at Islam as another movement. And one of the points that Imam Jamil used to tell us is that the movement began when the first slaves sought an alternative to slavery. When the first slave rebelled, that's when the movement began. It went from that movement, the Niagara movement, you know, then you had the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and now we're in the phase of the Islamic movement. And so that's what we have to understand, that movement is just, as I say, it's movement, it's continuous, it struggles. If you're stagnant, it's like stagnant water, it breeds disease, it gets moldy. So we have to keep moving. We carried the baton at a certain point, your generation have to take that baton and take it to the next point. And so I don't know what it's going to look like in the next phase. You know, Imam Jamil influenced me when I was about your age or a little younger. And so to the point that I said, you know, I wanted to get involved on certain levels. And then when he became a Muslim, I said, okay, I think that's the program. And what he said is that when he was struggling in the civil rights movement, he did not have a book for struggle. He didn't have a book for stroke. They were just, basically playing it by ear, just doing what they needed to do. They were taking tips from across the world. And one of the points he used to make to show how the struggle was just basically not properly directed in this country, he said that guys were walking around with green fatigues standing against red brick walls. Camouflage fatigue. So camouflage is supposed to be camouflage, but you standing against red brick walls with green fatigues on. So he said we didn't really have a strong concept of what struggle was. And if you look at his last book, it's called Revolution by the Book. He's talking about the Quran. The Quran gives you, as I said, it's also a medicine book, but it's also a book for struggle. And if we read it right, I visited him in November, and one of the points that he imparted to me, he said that Muslims must contextualize Islam. We must make Islam make sense. We can't walk around trying to be black Arabs, or as I mentioned before, being Blackistanis, or basically taking the culture of the people who may practice Islam, whether they're from Africa, whether they're from Asia, whether they're from Arabia. We have a long history of Islam. There are many of the slaves on both sides of my family, both slaves were Muslims. And I'm sure if we each did our genealogy, you're going to find Muslim slaves that came over. And so we're the answer to their prayer. There were Muslims that prayed, may my lineage be Muslim. And so we're the answer to their prayer. Allah has planted Islam firmly in this country, and so we have a big job to do. Give the dawah, but also make people understand Islam. Those that don't become Muslim, we converse. Those that want to become Muslim, we convert. But it's Allah who makes Muslims. You can't sit with somebody 20 minutes and expect them to change their whole life. I'm debating with a Christian right now through email. He works at a store I frequent all the time. He asked me one day, am I Muslim? I said, yeah. So he's born again Christian, but he's bringing me Christian texts, and we emailing each other. And I remember giving dawah to a brother from Detroit for 5 years. 5 years. And he was a Pan-Africanist. And we talked for 5 years before he took a shahada. So we have to get away from this narrative that a person, you can sit with a person for 5-10 minutes and they change their whole life. You take your time. Allah makes Muslims. And that's what we have to understand, because we ego trip thinking we make Muslims. But it's Allah. We are conduits for the word. And so we have to be able to understand our role, check ego at the door, because ego, the acronym for ego, means easing God out. And so what we have to do is basically impart the word, plant the seed like the farmer, and we may not be around to see that tree coming to fruition.
Well, inshallah, God willing, we're granted success.
Amen.
And everything that you're doing, my generation, along with myself, will be able to carry it on.
Alhamdulillah.
Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. I appreciate it. Inshallah, may Allah give you success with your program, and those viewing this tape, may they get the best of our intentions and be able to benefit from the words that we imparted, because any goodness that comes from this interview, all praise is due to Allah, and all mistakes are mine.
Amen.
Wow.